Orthodox live listener call-in program. Informative conversation about subjects that matter through the lens of Scripture and the teaching tradition of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Join the conversation by calling 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. And now, here's Kevin.
Christ is risen. Well, good evening, and thank you for joining me on the premiere of Ancient Faith Today. And we're broadcasting, streaming this program live on April 22nd of Bright Week, which is Thomas Sunday, the week after Eastern Orthodox Pascha, or Easter. And for those of you that missed the program live, will be available for downloads next week on the AFR archives. I'm very pleased you're with us from wherever you're listening on your internet radios or your computers. And we're going to be talking about subjects that matter as they relate to our faith and the Orthodox Christian worldview every other Sunday evening. And what, of course, makes this program different is that you are part of the conversation. The special inaugural program, by the way, will run 90 minutes tonight instead of the normal 60 that we'll generally schedule, and I hope you'll plan to spend the time with us. And how this is going to work is we're going to open the phone lines for calls from the U.S. and Canada tonight. After our first break, that'll be in about 15 or 20 minutes, and that number is 1-855-AF-RADIO. Again, 1-855-237-2346. We can only take calls tonight from the U.S. and Canada, but we'll be adding lines for international calls shortly. Now, for those of you that may be a little timid about calling us, email us your question. We have a producer watching those, and that email is aft@ancientfaith.com. When you email us, please give us your first name and city and state, please. Well, this evening our topic is the resurgence of atheism, an increasingly aggressive, some might say even cantankerous version of atheism. And you've probably heard of the so-called new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and the late Christopher Hitchens, men who have written books with titles like The God Delusion, Breaking the Spell, Darwin's Dangerous Idea, The End of Faith, and God is Not Great. And in addition to books and articles and interviews, they seem to be on an endless debate schedule promoting their non-theistic worldviews. The Christian philosopher David Bentley Hart, in his book, The Atheist Delusion, he happens to be Orthodox, by the way, calls them, quote, Christianity's most fervent detractors. Well, the question tonight is, who are they? Who are these new atheists? What are they claiming? How do we as Orthodox Christians respond? How do we speak to our children when they're challenged by the increasingly secular agendas and worldviews in the public education system, universities, and of course the media? How do we reconcile some of their challenges with our own faith, intellectually and factually? Well, that's our subject tonight on Ancient Faith Today. And I'm pleased to have two guests on the program tonight who have thought, written about, and been deeply engaged in this subject. And they are Father Hans Jacobsy and Dr. John Mark Reynolds. Father Hans is the president of the American Orthodox Institute. He's the editor of OrthodoxyToday.net, the pastor of St. Peter Antiochian Orthodox Church in Fort Myers, Florida, and an Orthodox culture warrior who has debated with atheists. Father Hans, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Kevin. Pleasure to be here.
My pleasure to have you. Thanks so much. And my guest is Dr. John Mark Reynolds, philosopher, author of When Athens Met Jerusalem, co-author of Three Views of Creation and Evolution with J.P. Moreland, and Against All Gods, What's Right and Wrong About the New Atheism with Philip E. Johnson. You may know that name because he's the so-called father of the intelligent design movement, and I referred to both of these books in my background research. Dr. Reynolds is the founder and director of the Torrey Honors Institute, and he's the associate professor of philosophy at Biola University in La Mirada, California, and he's the newly appointed provost of Houston Baptist University, which he and his family will join in June. He's one of the best-kept secrets in the Orthodox Church as well. John Mark, welcome to the program. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. It's a fun topic.
It is. It is. And one you've spoken and written a lot about. By the way, you'll be missed here in Southern California, but our loss is Houston's gain. So God bless you with that.
Well, I'm headed to Houston for the weather, so
there you go.
It's an improvement.
Well, if you like wet, wet and hot it is.
Sarcasm, it's an ugly thing.
Well, gentlemen, as we begin, it seems to me that there are four main premises, and the way we're going to do this is we're going to start with general ideas and then kind of break them down into specific claims and charges that these new atheists make and get your take on them from an Eastern Orthodox worldview. But the main premises seem to be that, one, science presents evidence that unintelligent and natural processes are capable of creating, and they would argue did in fact create, the cosmos. Two, that science disproves the need for God in creation. And three, since God can't be proven by empirical evidence, therefore God is at best highly improbable, unworthy of belief, and they would claim the cause of various religion-caused ills, wars, violence, superstition, oppression, sexual repression, and God should therefore be rejected. So my first question is to John Mark. John Mark, what's new, if anything, about the new atheists from the classic old atheists, you know, men like Hume and Thomas Huxley and Bertrand Russell and Nietzsche?
Well, I actually don't think there is much new. Bertrand Russell famously became very aggressive, one would say irrational, by the end of his life about lots of his pet causes. You might think of the new atheists as being the equivalent of TV evangelists for atheism. They embarrass a little bit mainstream atheists. Mainstream atheists wish they would go away, but they generate lots of attention, and that attention helps the atheist cause, so atheists have a hard time getting rid of them. They kind of say out loud also what happens in a lazy sort of way in a lot of grad programs or secular universities where, let's face it, most people haven't thought about religion seriously since they were in 5th grade. So the new atheism is good in that sense. It's putting out in public what kind of lazy thinking has been going on among secularists for the last, 100 years. It's kind of Victorian atheism hopped up for the internet age. Richard Dawkins has better hair than most of the old atheists.
You know, also, too, I was surprised to find on the 55 freeway in Southern California about 6 months ago, don't know whether you saw it, a huge billboard that said something along the lines of, you can tell your family and friends that you don't believe in God, small g, and it was some atheist group. So I think, too, they're using popular media and, you know, really being much more aggressive than maybe we've seen before.
Yeah, Father, it was really hard, let's say a decade ago, when atheists, in the name of atheism, people were killing, you know, millions of Christians all over the world, in particular in communist countries. Right. Atheism became associated with mass murder, which is never good for your movement, and most Americans decided they didn't like atheists. If Christians think they have a PR problem, they should try being an atheist for a weekend. So sometimes I'm sympathetic with these new atheists. A lot of times they seem to be engaged in a sort of group therapy to say, hey, we're okay, we're not Stalinists, we don't want to kill people. They spend a lot of time, in fact, trying to convince people they're friendly, which is sometimes scary to me. When people start announcing they're friendly, then I wonder. But it's hard to blame them. The entire movement got associated with mass murder over the last 50, 60 years.
Right. Father Hans, as John Mark points out, atheism is still a minority view. I read a recent study that says between 1 in 5 and 4% only of Americans admit to a hard version of atheism. But a larger share of the American public, about 20%, according to the Pew Report, spurns or organized religion in favor of skepticism about faith and religion. What do you think, Father Hans, is appealing to this generation about this new atheism, especially to youth, and why is it having a resurgence in popularity, or is it?
Well, it is having a resurgence in popularity, and on a popular level, John Mark's criticism is absolutely right on. Once you start looking at them and reading them, you see this fundamental incoherence. Nevertheless,
import. I run into these people all the time. Of course, their ideas and their thinking isn't that developed, but on a popular level, it usually isn't. But what's the danger here? This is what I see. You know, there's almost an article of faith here, a certainty in what I call the nihilistic impulse. Okay, that's my word for it. The problem with atheism and the tearing down of religions, even the cultural forms, the cultural memory of Christian precepts and what it gave culture, is that it allows for the disintegration of the individual. A lot of people have assimilated the anti-Christian polemic uncritically, but they still have assimilated it, and then so they start living their life with any governing principle except what I call the moral inversion, that the only freedom that exists is having no boundaries and no moral structure at all. And you see this in the culture a lot. You know, Charles Murray just came out with a new book, and he talks about that, really the loss of what I would term, you know, Christian identity. And it's not to say that you have to believe, but at least you lived within those frameworks and the Christian moral precepts. What the new atheism provides these people who are fundamentally morally confused is kind of a coherent structure of self-destruction. You know, atheism is nihilistic at its core. It really is. But it sounds so reasonable to a lot of people. And I think that's dangerous.
You know, it seems to me that beginning with men like Blessed Augustine through Thomas Aquinas and up to the present, Western Christianity especially has attempted to respond to its atheistic critics with a rationally formed and rationally justified theology. By the way, I borrowed that from your book, John Mark, on page 8. And it sets reason along with Scripture at the center of its faith. So my question to you, John Mark Reynolds, is there a risk, in your opinion, in trying to justify supernatural causes, as the West has tried to do, by the rules of scientific naturalism and scientific methodologies? Are we falling into some trap, if you will, by playing by their rules to justify or prove the existence of that which is ineffable?
If we did that, that would be a very, very bad idea. We should not do that. On the other hand, religious people make some claims that can, at least in principle, be shown true or false. I mean, if we found Jesus' body, then the Easter event, as Paul himself points out, would be disproved, and we would be, of all people, most miserable. But reason's a funny term. Reason is a tool. It's a tool that helps us think well. Almost everybody agrees we should think well. But we don't want to use our reason beginning with assumptions that will sort of guarantee the results. And so I agree with you that sometimes Christians defend their faith having already bought into a particular view of reality such that they can't win. So if nature is all there is, was, or ever will be, if my personal experience doesn't count as evidence, if the supernatural is viewed as so weird that it's going to require huge amounts of evidence for me to believe that I received a healing or that someone was healed, then I think we bought into an assumption that religion is always on the defensive and that we need some kind of extraordinary reason to believe.
Yeah, good point. But isn't so-called empirical evidence, you know, John Mark or Father Hans, kind of just pieces of the greater puzzle?
Well, sure, but empirical claims demand empirical evidence. So if I said I was sick, at one point I was sick, I went to church. It was a local Russian church, and I was in prayer during the evening service, and I was better. In principle, that's an empirical claim, and I should be able to prove that I was sick, and then I wasn't sick anymore. What I can't prove for sure is that God did it, and I see no reason for Christians to be defensive about that God did it. It seems to me that God did it, so why not?
Father Hans, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. See, part of this, and John Mark is touching on this. Part of this also is a cultural shift we're experiencing, and that Christians don't always realize. The truth of the gospel, and just truth, even relative truth, circumstantial, existential truth, whatever is true references him who is truth, who is Jesus Christ. So truth can be proclaimed even without saying his name sometime, by just speaking truthfully, is not contained within the proposition itself. Christians think what they have to do is build up a logical structure to refute the claims of the atheist. That's not going to work. That really is not going to work. What you have to do is you have to speak truth to a circumstance or to a situation. This is the way I approach it, and this is the way I approached it in my debate with Matt Dillahunty. You don't go to prove God is true. What you do is you speak the truth. There's a different thing, and that requires discernment and other things. If we believe that Christianity is propositional, in other words, if we just build up the logical superstructure and it's all coherent and it all fits together, so on and so forth, and if we believe that if we perceive that superstructure in its fullness, we'll see the face of God, we've already lost. And that's what Christians do. They listen to the debates of the atheists, and instead of discerning really what's being said and the presuppositions that are being made, they take the claims at face value when they shouldn't. What they should really do is look deeply into the claims and the assertions and figure out the presuppositions behind them and challenge those.
I have about 2.5 minutes before we're going to take a break, and I'd like to ask this question before we do, and then we'll maybe follow up a bit on some of this as well. What does Eastern Orthodox Christianity bring new or useful to the dialogue that we're having, that Western Christianities, and I use the plural for the reason that there are various Christianities, hasn't brought to it? I mean, noetic experience, the mystery, different methodologies. John Mark, why don't you start, and then Father Hans, why don't you have the last word on that?
Well, I'll say a simple thing, and that is that most Americans don't realize that, for example, in my area, Plato's studies, we wouldn't be doing much work at all if it weren't for the fact that the Byzantine, the Eastern Orthodox Church, maintains studies in Greek texts, in Greek philosophy, all the way through its history, and then educated particularly the Florentines and others in Greek thought. So to the extent that we do philosophy in the west of the world, we owe an enormous debt to the east of the world, to the Eastern Orthodox Church, for acting as kind of our parents, our school, when it comes to philosophy. Islam contributed as well, but Islam, of course, picked up their first exposure often from the Byzantines when they would conquer an area. So Eastern Christians can hold their head up proudly and realize that though we went back and forth with it, we always maintained an engagement with the best secular thought without being subsumed by it, without letting it lead our thinking. And that makes me proud to be Orthodox.
Yeah, there's also, and we're coming up on about a minute left, there's also a great aversion to kind of fundamentalism in Christianity by these new atheists. They seem to pick apart the, again, almost the caricature of some Christians, and I think that's harder to do with the Eastern Orthodox Church. Father Hans?
That's absolutely true. And a lot of it goes back to what John Mark says. Truth is truth. What's real is real. Okay? And there's no such thing as branding something as Christian truth and then say some other kind of truth. Truth is just truth. And when you encounter truth, you can affirm it as truth because it's true. And so there isn't a bifurcation really between the Christian and the experience of everyone else in the world. Now, we might experience certain events differently, but we have nothing to hide from. In fact, And I think we have to learn this and learn how to do this. I think that if we really understand our Orthodox faith properly, I think what we bring to the table is a way to unify truth, to see it in a more comprehensive and coherent way. And that's abstract. I realize that, but you can affirm whatever is true to anybody who is open to the truth, whether they're Christian or not. In fact, I would say if they are open to the truth, they're probably closer to Christianity than many Christians who believe that Christianity itself requires the negation of some things that are true. It goes back to what I was talking about with the propositional Christianity. The truth of things aren't in the proposition. They really aren't in how we describe what truth is. The truth is in the object. The truth is in the knowledge. The truth is in the subject.
Alrighty, Father Hans, we're gonna need to take a break now, sir. We'll follow back up on that, but we'll take a short break, and then when we come back, Father, I'll let you finish that sentence. I realize I cut you off. I'm sorry. And I'd also like to discuss some of the main arguments. Please call us at 855-237-2346, 1-855-AF-RADIO, and stay with us. We'll be right back.
Ancient Faith Today with Kevin Allen will be back in a moment. In the meantime, we invite your calls at 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Lines are open for your call. The number is 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Here once again is Kevin Allen.
Welcome back to Ancient Faith Today, and we're speaking with Father Hans Jacobsy and Dr. John Mark Reynolds. The subject is the New Atheists, and we have a caller, Gary from Placentia, California. Gary, good to have you on the program.
Yeah.
What's your question?
Well, my question is, it seems like we have an ongoing conversation in America today that seems to go this way, that you can either believe in religion or you can believe in science, but you can't believe in both. I'm just curious how you would answer those kind of questions. That's a really common question I keep running into, and I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Are science and religion at odds?
This is John Mark Reynolds. I think that we should believe science. When science says something that's true, we should believe it, because all truth is worthy of belief. The problem is, of course, that scientists, just like theologians or anybody else, aren't always right. In the early history of the church, science safely delivered to us the proposition that women weren't quite human, that they were defective men. And sadly, some people in the church spent tons of time trying to figure out how science, or at least some kind of naturalistic philosophy, could be made compatible with the Christian faith. Well, it turned out that this was entirely wrong. So science and religion are compatible when we understand science and religion correctly. The problem is that simple-minded people often take one pronouncement of some scientists and assume that if we don't believe that immediately, that somehow we've fallen off the edge of the rationality platter. So this is silly, but I'm afraid a lot of people fall into it.
Gary, does that answer the question?
Well, yeah, I see people like Dawkins. When people like him speak these days, somehow there's the force of being a scientist, that just the fact that he's such a well-renowned scientist, and he says that religion isn't really even valuable to even enter into our conversations, that really it's a silly, superstitious kind of idea, that I hear this so often. It just seems like, this is kind of a basic place we need to start with in these conversations. That's all.
So, Gary, let me ask you a question that sometimes helps people that I'm talking to, and I think the best thing we can often do when people make pronouncements like this is ask questions. Does science show us what the world should be or what the world is?
Well, science will tell you how it is.
Yeah, that's right. So how in the world could a scientist, inside of his qualifications as science, tell us how the world should be? How's that scientist going to get should from is?
Very good.
Yeah, it's people, I have a PhD in philosophy, and you could ask me my opinion on the best football team in America, and I would tell you it was the Green Bay Packers. But the truth be told, you have no more reason to respect my opinion because I have a PhD in philosophy, and maybe pretty decent reason to doubt it on football than anything else in the world. So these people are often trading on their awesome scientific credentials, though many of them don't actually have awesome scientific credentials, to act like experts on something else. I'll suggest that your local priest knows more about what it is to live the good life and has thought more about it than Richard Dawkins.
Thanks, Gary. Appreciate your call very much. I've got a call from Bob in Fountain Valley. Bob, good to have you on the program.
Yes.
Thank you. And what's your question?
I've got a question. One of the things that I love about Orthodox Christianity is it doesn't try to explain or rationalize everything. The mystery is at the heart of our faith, and I just want to know, why do we need to prove anything to atheists? Isn't the proof in the experience?
Good question.
Well, I don't want to prove anything to an atheist as a philosopher. I'm just bearing witness to what I've discovered. But if somebody, I don't be simple about this, but if somebody says that I can't believe what I believe because I'm nuts, or tries to convince people that my voice should be silenced in the public square, it isn't so much that I'm trying to, hog-tie intellectually an atheist and make them a believer. I've never seen that work. I'm just suggesting that when they claim that Christianity has nothing to say to the intellect, they're wrong.
Father Hans, you want to weigh in on that one?
Yeah, I don't think that if a person is an atheist, but he's fundamentally an honest person, I'm not talking about the evangelical atheists like Dawkins and Hitchens. I mean, they have an almost apostolic zeal. Okay, I'm just talking about your run-of-the-mill person who has kind of assimilated the ideas of the dominant culture, and so he's kind of an armchair atheist. A lot of people like that. The thing is that life itself doesn't allow you to hold on to the atheist assumptions very easily, because life is tough, and life brings hardship, and hardship causes you to ask deeper questions. I see this a lot, especially with the declining economy and people are suffering and so on and so forth. It's not so much that you try and refute the atheist or convert the atheist. That's not going to happen. What it is when you're talking to someone and their questions are genuine. It's not just polemical. They're not just trying to beat you down. What you really do is ask him the tough questions. Well, if there is no God, then what's going to happen when you die? That kind of thing. If there is no God, then why is it? How can you be sure that what you believe is really true? See, and if the person is honest, he'll listen to that and he'll examine that and he'll see that atheism cannot really answer any questions about meaning, destiny, or purpose. It simply can't. It just makes assertions. That's all it does.
Thank you for your call, Bob. I appreciate you calling in. And that number, by the way, for call-ins is 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Well, Father Hans and John Mark, let's begin with the main arguments of the new atheists. The first one is that faith is irrational. God is an improbable human invention. I believe Dawkins calls it a need for a sky daddy. Faith is a delusion. and no more probable than a, quote, flying spaghetti monster, one of the other new atheists called religion that. So let me start with you, John Mark. Is there a rational basis other than a leap of faith to belief in a theistic creator with unlimited power and omniscience?
Well, of course, proving anything exists is pretty difficult for philosophers to do. So I always like to suggest that if a new atheist can demonstrate to me how he knows the external world exists and not just his own head, that I will then proceed to talk with him about whether there is a God. But let me make a suggestion that I don't hear often, which is new atheists seem to believe that just because I'm glad there's a God is a reason to suspect it. There's a kind of deep-seated puritanical hatred of jolly news inside the new atheism. Boy, I think it would be really awesome if we had a sky daddy, if there was a loving God who was going to take care of things and make sure that there's justice in the end. And in fact, when one gets super pleasant news like this, that's a good reason to take a risk on it. So I don't think you should take an irrational risk. I didn't buy a lottery ticket in this last go-round of the lottery because it was a fairly irrational risk. I was so unlikely to win. But there's decent enough evidence from my own personal experience and from philosophic argumentation and from the history of humanity that there is a God. And for some reason, the new atheists seem to think that because I'm glad that that's true, that that's a reason to doubt it. In fact, I think that's a pretty good reason to go for it, to take a risk on the truth of Christianity. I'm so sorry that these people are depressed, if they are, and want the world to be worse than it really is.
One of you, I hope, will, maybe both of you either, I'd like to very briefly kind of go through the common arguments one hears, especially from the West, establishing a rational basis for faith. Do you find these arguments, you know, the cosmology argument and so on, the design argument, do you find those useful? And could you kind of briefly review them and kind of walk us through them?
Yeah, it probably would be better not to briefly review them, because then you'd run the risk of, first of all, putting everyone to sleep, second of all, getting it wrong in the details. There are quite a few arguments for the existence of God. Richard Swinburne points out that all of them have problems. Richard Swinburne is a Christian philosopher and now Orthodox Christian. He moved from the Church of England, who says, though all the arguments have problems, like any argument in philosophy, taken cumulatively, it allows a rational person to say, look, I believe in God, my experience says there's a God, my mysterious encounter with God says there's a God, and these reasons are the kinds of reasons I would expect to find if God really existed. So I don't think you can start with reasons for the existence of God and argue people into the certainty of the truth of Christianity. After all, we have faith, we don't have certainty. And the other thing I run into with the new atheists is the good thing about them. The thing I love about most atheists I know is that they at least claim to be in love with wondering about things. And wonder is wonderful. And the nice thing about being a Christian is that faith allows room for wondering, allows room for sensible doubts. I can talk to my pastor and say, wow, this doesn't make sense, and he doesn't smite me with his crozier immediately. So I appreciate that when I actually run into it in a new atheist. They just seem to think that skepticism means you can never assert anything, that you can never make any claim except negative claims. Whereas I think a good, healthy dose of wonder just makes me want to take a risk on goodness, truth, and beauty.
Father Hans, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think it's valid to raise skepticism as a metaphysical principle. I mean, life just isn't like that. You know, there's too much in life, and the experiences are too varied. That if you're going to hold to dogmatic atheism, what you're going to end up doing is you're going to be cutting off a lot of life. And you're going to have to negate experience, and if you keep doing that, you're just not going to see very clearly. And I think that's what happens. And then secondly, you know, everything always crystallizes around the central point, there is no God. Well, then tell me how you're going to live. How are you going to order society? How are you going to deal with real problems, say your kids are on drugs or something like that? How are you going to deal with it? And what you find is kind of a truncated understanding of how the human person works. The human contact gets diminished. And see, I find that when I talk to people who are kind of battling the atheist ideas, so on and so forth, they don't have answers for that. They don't even know how to think in those particular categories. But it's those events in life, and I think it is primarily experiential. It's those events in life, those questions you have to deal with, events or injustices that come upon you, that turn the mind and the heart to higher things. Now, if a person is really set against God, talking about God, soften it a little bit. Talk about the transcendent. Talk about knowledge that is not empirical. They say, what do you mean? I say, well, prove to me love exists. Well, put love under a microscope. You can't. Prove to me beauty exists. Well, put beauty under a microscope. You can't. There's all sorts of knowledge in life that is non-empirical, but it's as powerful as empirical knowledge. Open a person's mind to that, and that's part of his everyday experience. And then they begin to see that the atheist claim actually is a truncation of experience, and it's a truncation of awareness.
Yeah, let me put a good word in for the atheists I know. I mean, not all atheists are the new atheists, and I really benefited from education from thoughtful atheists because, strangely enough, here in the west of the world, atheists are often pretty consistently following the Judeo-Christian tradition. They've just backed out of some of the claims of it. And so this is where I think Father Hans is making an important point. I have students all the time that think that they would be better at running Tory because they would just take over and do my job minus the obvious mistakes I make. And heaven knows I make a lot of mistakes. And it's, 8th graders would all be better than their parents because they would be their parents minus the mistakes. And I think that my friends who are atheists often look at the culture, a culture they couldn't have started, places like Oxford and Cambridge, where folk like Dawkins work, where engraved in the very stone of the building is the truth of the gospel. And they want to get rid of the parts of it that are uncomfortable or that, given contemporary science, are difficult. And there are always parts like that. I don't blame them for wanting to do that. But I really question whether they could have generated Oxford to start with. And if they can maintain it once they become a simple majority. Certainly Western Europe doesn't look promising on that front. So first of all, it is absolutely the case that often a practicing atheist is a nicer person than some Christians you will meet, and more consistently following the commands of Jesus in some areas of their life. But I do think that atheism ends up being parasitic on Russian culture, for example. The old joke was, if you saw a beautiful building in Russia, it was built by the czars and ruined by the communists. And so I wonder if atheism, even nice forms of atheism, don't end up being parasitic on a more broadly Christian culture.
Well, I'm speaking with Father Hans Jacobsi, and I'm speaking with Dr. John Mark Reynolds. Our topic is the New Atheists. And the call-in number we'd love to hear from you is 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. And we're on Facebook and Twitter, and you can email us your question at aft@ancientfaith.com. Gentlemen, we have about 4 minutes before a break. I'd like to switch gears with you a little bit and kind of go back to what our caller Gary brought up, and that is the claim made that science and religion are at odds. Either you have to believe one or the other. And you touched on that issue.
Here's how I answer that, Kevin.
Sorry?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. It's a false dichotomy. And I use the same logic that John Mark used. It says science can only describe and give us knowledge about operations in the universe that are observable. Okay, once it goes beyond that, it's no longer science. Right. So people extract the principles and they talk about the future, they talk about the past. Okay, you can do that, that's fair, but you can't call it scientific. You can't. because there's no way that you can prove that. So this idea that there's only two kinds of knowledges and they're in opposition to each other simply is not true. I mean, even the knowledge that we extract from science, how we apply it itself becomes a value judgment. Okay, should we apply the knowledge in this way? Should we apply it in that way? You know, do we use the technology to build concentration camps, or do we use the technology to build hospitals? In both cases, the scientific processes, the techniques we employ are the same. But how they're employed as a value judgment, that is derived outside of science. So they both work together.
Interestingly, I just heard or saw rather a YouTube that Metropolitan Kallistos Ware, we're all familiar with him. He's the retired Oxford Dean, or Don rather, and Orthodox Metropolitan, who said that he kind of takes a two-world view, that there's the world of data that comes from the senses, which is the realm of science, and then there's the realm of data that comes from revelation, which is the world of theology. Would you buy into that?
I do think that revelation gives us data and that we have to build on it. I would want us to be able to show why we think that data is trustworthy, and I think one reason for thinking it's trustworthy is that it helped produce science and the scientific method itself. So hooray for science, but in fact, monotheistic religions in particular were the major contributors to developing the very principles that science takes for granted. We have to ask questions like, why does math work? So the very language of science, mathematics, can't be proven or shown by empirical science. And yet math, in something like physics, can be very useful. We developed certain maths long before physics demanded our need for them. So the belief that I'm just going to believe things that I can see empirically would cut us off from the resources of math. So if we start with questions like that, then I think we can discover that Christianity, in particular, Judaism certainly, and Islam to some extent, have provided the world through monotheism with the basic ideas that made science possible in the first place. And like a lot of children who grow up and forget their dependence on their parents or on the godparents, on the people that got them to where they are, these modern scientists are taking for granted ideas that we helped produce.
That's absolutely true. I'm real uncomfortable with the whole kind of the reason-revelation distinction. I mean, if the world is created by God, and that's what we believe, and it was spoken into existence, okay, the material operations of creation are just one dimension of the knowledge that we can hold. It doesn't follow that the knowledge, empirical knowledge, is of some way higher or opposed to the other types of knowledge. It just isn't true. And when we use the terms like reason and revelation, or empirical knowledge and revelation, it creates a bifurcation that fundamentally, in our thinking anyway, separates and posits two different kinds of knowledge. Now, maybe you can call them different modes of knowledge, but knowledge is knowledge. Knowledge is knowledge, and we do believe that the world is integrated. We believe that it holds together. We believe that at the center of the world is somehow the spoken word of God that still resonates through it. So, I don't want to elevate one to kind of the nether story and call it revelation. This is very, very much a part of human, concrete experience. And it's what makes our life
I do think
full and
when
whole.
Politicians say they're for choice, they're actually talking about abortion. I do think we need to face the fact that when people talk about religion and science problems, they almost always mean Darwinism or evolution. And I will say this, the details of that sort of thing should have a show all by itself. But the good news for an Orthodox Christian is something like modern evolutionary theory could be true and Christianity still be true. There would be forms of biblical interpretation that wouldn't work anymore, but we could develop new ones. On the other hand, if you're Richard Dawkins, something like Darwinism has to be true. It's the only game in town. It's the only thing that can make it even remotely plausible. If science can't explain intelligence, for example, and the appearance of intelligence, then a miracle exists, and Richard Dawkins is in trouble. So the good news for someone like I am in philosophy is that my Christianity, my Orthodox Christianity, allows me to consider any number of possibilities about how God brought the world into existence. Now, I happen to be fairly skeptical of the standard scientific story and wanting to try out other ideas. But if somebody finds their intellect or their profession getting in the way, who's an Orthodox Christian, they're also free to adopt conventional scientific answers. The only difference would be that we think that God acted in space and time in a way that's verifiable. We're just arguing about the evidence. So I find that Christianity actually opens more possibilities in science for what God might have done or what might be true in nature. It doesn't stick me with a 19th century belief inherited from the colonial British about what must be true since we know there is no God.
Gentlemen, we're going to need to take a short break. And when we come back, we'll follow up on the science and religion issue, and we'll take your calls. And I believe we have an atheist who is interested in weighing in, and we'll talk with him soon. The numbers are 855-AF-RADIO, 1-855-237-2346.
Ancient Faith Today with Kevin Allen will be back in a moment. In the meantime, we invite your calls at 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Lines are open for your call. The number is 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Here once again is Kevin Allen.
Well, welcome back to Ancient Faith Today, and we're speaking again with Father Hans Jacobsi, and we're speaking with Dr. John Mark Reynolds. Our subject is the new atheism movement and the new atheists, and we were talking about science and religion. Are they at odds? And I was very glad to hear both of you say that they really are not at odds, so we don't have to reject scientific judgment. But what do we do? And let me start with you, Father Hans, and then John Mark jump in, as I know you will. How can we use the gospel as an example when it appears to conflict with our worldview? And then I do have an atheist who wants to weigh in, so maybe be brief on that one.
Well, if there's a conflict, either our worldview is off or our reading of Scripture is off. One of the two. Making the assertion that there's no final conflict between science and faith doesn't mean that the categories we employ today are necessarily adequate. They change. They change whenever new knowledge comes along. So none of this is fixed in stone. As Christians, we don't have to be defensive. A lot of Christians are. I realize that because they don't know how to address the assault on Christianity. But we don't have to be defensive because knowledge is knowledge. Truth is truth. Sometimes we have to shift our own thinking because we're not thinking correctly. I have no problem with that at all.
Okay, I'd like to take the call, if he's on the line, from Richard in Covina. He is an atheist. Richard, how are you? And welcome to Ancient Faith Today.
Hi, Kevin. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thanks. Yeah, I can hear you very well. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. I'm sorry I didn't hear all of the radio program. I tuned in about 5:30. I jumped in. I don't know who was talking. It was one of the two men, discussing how kind of atheism couldn't, what's the word, socially, what was the wording that he used? It was something along the lines of kind of atheism not being able to fulfill certain things socially. Was it?
Yeah, it was probably me. And my difficulty is when I chat with folk, and I do, who are my friends who are atheists, they have a very hard time pointing to a culture whose basic assumptions have been founded on atheisms. And of course, there are many variations of atheism. If people want to see a denominational fight, they should go on Richard Dawkins' home boards and watch the purges that take place there. And they'll be reminded of the local Baptist church. But there are many forms of atheisms, and their problem is it's not clear that a world-class culture has ever been formed by one. And so that doesn't mean it can't be done. I can't prove it can't be done. Hard to prove a negative. It just should give us all pause that it never has been done. Since atheism itself is an idea, see Lucretius, isn't a new idea.
Well, Richard, what's your question?
Well, I would like to respond to that first. Well, of course, there have been no real atheist societies. For the most part, most countries have been especially religious. Atheism didn't really have terribly many places to kind of take root anywhere. There weren't terribly many.
That's true, Richard. Ancient Rome had a dominant atheistic class, at least in private.
They were.
And a lot of serious atheistic philosophers, and it just didn't work out for them.
What about Soviet
Russia?
Russia?
Work out because of a change in the religious climate. That's when Christianity rose. The Epicureans were taken out along with the other pagan religions. As soon as Christianity started to rise, they faded out.
Yeah, they lost the battle of ideas, Richard. For 300 years, Christianity lived in a persecuted minority status where not only did we not have the ability to persecute atheists or pagans, we were actually sporadically persecuted by them. And sadly, for atheism, again, this doesn't prove for sure it's false, they simply lost the persuasive battle of ideas. People heard what they had to say. In fact, people were more readily...
The Justinian Code has laws against atheism.
When did Justinian live, Richard?
Oh, God.
That's hundreds and hundreds of years after the period of time we're talking about. So Christianity existed. Justinian was the Christian emperor that came after Constantine, and until 333, that is when Theodosius did it, Christianity played as an equal player inside the Roman Empire, and simply paganism and atheism lost in the marketplace of ideas, even though it was persecuted.
Over a slow period of time. But I'm veering. What the point was, there have not been atheist civilizations. Number one, religion does help a country unite.
Richard, what would you call the Soviet Union if not an atheist country?
Yes.
What would you call communist China if not an atheist country? What would you call Cambodia if not an atheist country? What would you call Romania pre-fall if not an atheist country?
I would call them secular countries, if anything. I wouldn't say, number one, I wouldn't say communism is directly tied to the concept that God does not exist. That's an economic and political system that has nothing to do with my belief in atheism at all.
They claimed to be atheist societies.
Let me bail Richard out here. I would say that the best case you've got are places like Sweden, which are really awesome places to live. I think Norway is the happiest nation on earth, and there are a fair number of secular people there. Yes?
Yeah.
So there could be a kind of jolly atheism that exists in Western Europe. My only problem, Richard, is that they're mostly living off of a cultural capital that as recently as the Second World War was overwhelmingly Christian. And it's not clear to me that they're doing a good job of sustaining those cultures.
My first statement was that I was acknowledging that there have not been atheist nations. Number one, because hold on.
Richard, can I get a question? Because I'm going to have to take another call. Give me a question, and then I appreciate it.
I'm trying.
Go ahead. Nobody speak. Richard, go ahead.
Okay. Well, what was I going to say? I'm terribly sorry, Kevin, that one.
No, it would make me nervous too. I mean, I can talk the leg off a mule, and here you are trying to have to think of something on the fly. So take your time, get a good question. I love good questions. Teach Socratically. What have you got?
I didn't really have any questions so much as I wanted to kind of address kind of certain ideals like that with atheist nations. I don't understand the concept of an atheist nation. My concept of an atheist nation is America, honestly, a nation which has no set religion. That doesn't
okay, we need to move on, Richard. Thank you for your call, and we'll discuss that as we continue to move forward, if that's okay. I appreciate that, and I do have a call from whom do I have a call from? From David from Detroit, who'd like to talk a little bit about youth going to colleges where there may be atheistic cultures. David, come on and join the conversation.
Thank you very much. My question is, how should the Orthodox Church and Orthodox Christians communicate with our young people, especially those who are going off to college and will be immersed at most colleges and universities in an atmosphere that's atheistic and hostile to Christianity? And I speak with some experience, having 3 of our 4 children go to your large state universities. And I know from their experience, the kind of atmosphere that young people live in those institutions.
Great. Thanks, David. Appreciate your call.
Well, I work with college students all the time, my own kids too. I think the first thing we're going to have to accept is that people need time to think and process. And my kids don't always agree with me. They may not end up believing what I believe, but I'm going to love them. I'm going to clearly witness to them my own faith. And so I think we have to start when we deal with anybody, whether it's a young adult or an older adult who's having doubts, is to give them space to have those doubts, to sit and listen and ask pertinent questions. It's unfair for poor Richard, who called into a call-in show with at least talkative me, but I would want to sit with somebody like Richard for hours and hours and try to get to the bottom of what he was thinking. Maybe he'd change my own thinking. And if we begin in this place of confidence, if a parish is a place where you can comfortably express doubts, where the response isn't overly hasty, and where then we strongly witness, I've gotten to the point with college students where I say, I just don't agree with you, and you don't agree with me, and we come to the parting of the ways in a conversation. But I think it begins with mutual respect inside a parish and an ability for people to air their honest doubts with what the church teaches.
Thank you, David. And we're going to need to cut away and take a brief, short break. And when we come back, we'll follow up a little bit on science and religion and are they at odds, and how we deal with some of the biblical issues that seem to conflict with science. For an example, Genesis 1, the narrative for creation. The number to call is 855-237-2346. I also have some email questions as well. Look forward to hearing from you.
Ancient Faith Today with Kevin Allen will be back in a moment. In the meantime, we invite your calls at 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Lines are open for your call. The number is 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Here once again is Kevin Allen.
Well, welcome back to Ancient Faith Today, and again, my guests are Father Hans Jacobsi and Dr. John Mark Reynolds, and I have an email question from Carrie from Chicago, and I don't think, in all fairness, and Father Hans, I want you to respond to this. I want you to respond to this, Father, first if you would, okay. And then we're going to take a phone call. What are the Orthodox churches uniquely what are our unique responses to atheists that other Christian traditions don't have or don't provide? What's unique about what we're doing other than the books you see from evangelicals and, you know, Dinesh D'Souza and those fellows?
It's abstract, but this is what I believe it is. It's a very, very good question. I just think we understand the human person in a deeper way. And I think because we understand the human person in a deeper way, I think we also have a deeper understanding. We don't practice this. We don't understand this as well as we should, but we really have a deeper understanding of the transformative power of the gospel and the word spoken in truth. You know, I'm not that worried about the polemical arguments. They have to be answered. I understand that. There has to be apologetics. But I'll tell you, apologetics won't convert the heart. You can convert the heart of the atheist if the atheist indeed in his atheism is looking for truth by speaking a word spoken in truth. Now, what is that? Well, you have to discern what that is. But I think sometimes, the power is this. If we really understand it, we can discern what the person needs to hear and the truth he's really looking for. We get this. And if we follow up and we do it right, I tell you, you will convert the heart. Now, I saw this, before I did my debate with Matt Dillahunty, I prayed, and I prayed hard. I studied, but I prayed. And this is what came to me in my prayer. Do the work of an evangelist. Understand that my purpose there isn't to convert the atheist. My understanding, my purpose there is to show the people that truth does exist and the truth exists outside of themselves. Because if you're an atheist, you're always stuck within a subjective prism. That's an ontological truth. Now, you can present that as a proposition. People might understand it, might not. But I'll tell you, experientially, existentially, they're facing that, and that leaves the heart dry. We get that. So I think if we approach it in terms of bringing truth to the human person, which means that we don't always argue polemically, but we argue in a way where our words really bring life. That, I think, is what we need to develop, and that's what I think is unique to our Orthodox understanding in this debate.
One of you brought up the idea that we're not in conflict, that every time science, discovers something, we should be able to or should reevaluate in light of that. And I know Augustine said that. But what do we do with literalism in terms of narratives like Genesis 1? I mean, are we supposed to take it as natural science? I mean, is Genesis 1 the creation story theological narrative, or is it a literal chronicle of events with, a historical timetable in spite of any scientific evidence to the contrary? John Mark, why don't you take a whack at that one?
The nice news about being an Orthodox Christian is that we're open to lots of different possibilities about how to read Genesis, and we'd have to talk to theologians to help us understand how to read it. And one thing that we're going to take into account is what scientists tell us is possible, what we could possibly believe. I tend to be a person who's open to a lot more options, probably, than most Orthodox Christians. I think more of the Genesis account is historical than a lot of people believe. But if that turns out to be wrong, and it's a different kind of literature, you'll notice I'm inside a church with the room for that to be true. So, I feel like my friends who are atheists are pretty much stuck with the Bible must be false in some very strong sense. Whereas I, as an Orthodox Christian, have lots of options, and I can be guided by the best literary theory and the best scientific theory and come to conclusions that are across the board.
The way I look at it is you really only have three options when it comes to any kind of creation narrative. There's the polytheistic, there's the monotheistic, and there's the materialist. Basically, everything falls under those three. Polytheistic, the world comes out of the stuff and substance of the gods. Monotheistic, and there's only one. The world is spoken into existence. Materialism is nothing exists except matter in the world, and processes somehow sprung out of that. And then what you do is you look at all three, and you look at which is coherent and which ultimately is the most creative. And the answer indisputably is the monotheistic narrative. We have to understand that this reliance on Darwinian evolution is really a creation story. It's not science. It's a creation story. And if we remember that and see that, then begin to understand it in those terms, I think that the viability of Genesis as a narrative really rises to the surface. You can't impose science on Scripture, okay? But you can't impose science on any creation narrative, including the materialist one. You really can't. The ground of knowing is narrative. I mean, God spoke the world into existence. This is a story that's given to us. The story doesn't purport to be scientific, but no story of origins can be scientific, even if people claim it is. It simply isn't. And I think once we dispense with that mythology, that somehow two options are myth and the other one is fact. If we dispense with that and realize, wait a second, they're all story, all three are stories, then I think the debris clears a little bit and we can talk a little bit more rationally about all of this.
Well, I've got a caller from Glendora, California. His name is Kevin. Kevin, thank you for calling in. What's your question?
Hi. I have two questions. The first question is, to what extent do you think that the Christian existentialist writers, such as Kierkegaard and Pascal, and then the novelists like Graham Greene or Walker Percy, would be useful for exploring Christian answers to atheist questions and this whole topic? And the second question is, how would you respond to, as far as I can tell, the only really good atheist argument against the existence of God, which is the problem of pain and suffering?
Oh, the second one is the hard one.
Yeah, that's right. First of all, the existentialists bring good issues to light, and we use them as resources and should use them as resources because they rightly responded to a kind of degenerate scholasticism where everything was known for sure, and we could make an argument for anything. So I know lots of students that really benefit from those readings. Sometimes they take it too far and become skeptical about knowing truth at all, but that isn't the fault of certainly Pascal. The second thing is, and then I'll throw it over to the Father, is that people need to remember that the problem of evil is an argument against the Christian God, because Christians assert that God is good. It wouldn't be an argument for atheism anyway. There could be a very malevolent single monotheistic God who just delights in tormenting us, for example. So whenever atheists tell me, well, I can't believe in God because of all the evil and suffering in the universe, I always respond, well, what you're saying is you can't believe in my God. Which is relevant to me, and that means I need to have some kind of response. But atheists often think they've proved more than they have because they're obsessed with Christianity, particularly fundamentalist forms of Christianity, and they think when they've refuted them that they've refuted all of religious thinking or even the existence of God. So Plato's God, for example, who isn't all-powerful, would not be refuted by the problem of evil. Now, since we believe God's all-powerful and good, it is a problem for us, and the hardest problem of all.
And Father Hans, I've got about 2 minutes to respond to that one.
I'm going to expand on John Mark's comment a little bit. He's absolutely right that the question of the problem of pain is against a Christian God, but so is a lot of atheism. Because if you look at the God that they're trying to describe, now some people say there is no God, and I don't have a concept of God. My question is, well, then why are you arguing against one? I mean, you're positing him in order to deny him, and that's a contradiction. Nevertheless, if you listen closely, the God that they're arguing against is always a Christian God. Okay, so which means that what they're doing is they're operating within the parameters of the Christian cultural inheritance. Now, what worries me about that, though, is say they take that to the end, right? If God is understood as monotheistic, which He is, and that's part of human development. The prophets bequeathed it to us, and then the apostles gave us the gospel. Christ became man, so on and so forth. It seems to me that if they really embrace the atheism to its logical end, and if culture does, or if culture at least is beaten down to the point where they have no more confidence in their Christianity and its cultural legacy, then what is left except nihilism? What is left except nihilism? Nothing. I can't see any other option. In that case, Nietzsche's right. Nietzsche's prophecy comes true. And the other thing that's left is the will to power and the strong man. So I'm making an argument here that we should refute the assumptions of the atheist, but I'm also arguing that atheism would have no coherence. It has no coherence, and the arguments have no coherence except within a Christian construct. Okay, if they are parasitic on Christianity, then Christianity ultimately has the answers that can set back and resolve the objections.
I also would like to read an email from Tracy. He is a scientist for over 20 years, and he writes that the more science reveals to us, the more obvious it is to him that it becomes, that the mystery, rather, of existence cannot be penetrated by science. And he says that's more of a comment than it is a question. And I'd like to leave it at that. We are going to take a break. And when we come back, I have a call from Father Adrian from New York.
Ancient Faith Today with Kevin Allen will be back in a moment. In the meantime, we invite your calls at 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Lines are open for your call. The number is 1-855-AF-RADIO. That's 1-855-237-2346. Here once again is Kevin Allen.
Welcome back to Ancient Faith Today. Appreciate you listening and calling in. Father Adrian from New York is on the line, and he'd like to ask a question. Welcome, Father Adrian, and Christ is risen.
Indeed, he is risen. First of all, thank you for the wonderful show that you have tonight. And my question is, I was reflecting a little bit on what I think Richard was his name called a little earlier, and he was talking about a more atheistic United States of America. So I was wondering, how do you see the relationship between the concept of political correct as a way of introducing atheism, maybe the way that it becomes more difficult to have a voice, a Christian voice in itself, in the public square, so to say, in public schools or even in that region, and how can we have a voice in the midst of this concept of politically correct?
Good question, Father Hans. Why don't you take a whack at that?
Well, I think you just don't accept the premise that you're not allowed to speak. I think you just speak and you take your hits. It's really that simple. As a political correctness will only prevail, this dogma will only prevail if we don't speak out against it. It's really that simple. And I don't. I do speak out against it. I just don't accept the assumptions. I think it's that simple. Just speak the truth. And if the truth has a cost, well, then you'll have to pay the cost.
I wonder if, Father Adrian, if you're talking about the political structure where it may in some cases be more and more difficult to speak out. Is that what your question is?
Yes, something to that matter, yeah.
You mean like
So it's one thing, Father, to speak out as an individual, but it seems like the deck is getting stacked more and more against speaking out in the public square and putting up, crosses and being able to speak about your faith in the public secular school system, etc. I think that's really what Father Adrian's referring to. John Mark, do you want to refer to that?
Yeah, there are two ways to look at the culture, and sometimes people overplay as if the Constitution of 1789 fell straight out of the mind of God or of Christianity. Or there's the stronger claim that we're a secular society. If we are a secular society, that means the overwhelming Christian majority of the last 200 years, remember that basically 80% of Americans still call themselves Christians, some of the very, very conservative sort, has allowed this to exist. So whatever we are is the product or the tolerated product of the overwhelming Christian majority for the last 200 years. In that sense, nobody disputes that the United States is a Christian nation. And will the overwhelming majority of Americans allow an overwhelming minority to tell them that they can't express their views? I have absolutely no fear that that's going to happen. In fact, I think we have to be careful sometimes. One reason I think new atheists are so aggressive is that we've fallen into our own kinds of political correctness, where if people start asking impertinent questions or tough questions, we silence them. But the good news is that the Christian majority in the United States has been so tolerant for so long that there actually can exist the new atheism. Nothing that exists in the U.S. could exist without our tolerance.
Thank you, Father Adrian. Very much appreciate your call.
Thank you.
I have a caller, a call from Adrian. Adrian, thank you for joining us this evening. And what's your question? I'm sorry, it's Cameron. Apologies. Cameron, please ask your question.
Yeah, thank you for taking my call.
You're welcome.
I meet atheists all the time, and we clearly have a different language. And they speak in scientific imperial terms, and I approach it with spiritual terms. And my question is, how can we have a conversation about God where we connect and have common ground and understand each other?
Now that's a good question. Who would like to take a crack at that one from Cameron?
Father, what have you found?
Well, see, I really approach it. I'm going to assume here this is a one-on-one conversation we're talking about, and not like to a group or to a class. Okay? I found just really listen. Because if you really listen, you can discern the question behind the question. Now, if it's a polemical argument, okay, then it's just polemics. Okay, everybody, you throw out your best shot, you shake hands, you leave. If it's a genuine, authentic, soul-touching, soul type discussion, just listen. Just listen. Because the moral values will creep in. The non-empirical will creep in. I think sometimes you have to define your terms. You have to explain what you mean. But the authentic atheist, and there are authentic atheists. There's a lot of them, who embrace atheism in the belief that it'll bring them to truth and bring them to some kind of clearer coherence. That's a value journey. That's a meaning journey. Okay. And so that's what I do. That's all I can tell you. And I just listen. And sometimes you give them the words. Sometimes if you can perceive and understand what it is that they're really trying to say, sometimes you can give them the language. Okay?
Yeah, I actually try to adopt the vocabulary of the person that I'm talking to, because I find that if I sit and listen and try to use words the way they are, I generally find they'll say something like this: science is good because it works, or they have a new word for good as in useful. And so then I'll ask them, why are useful things better than not useful things? And they'll say something like, because it works. And if I can get somebody talking in that way, pretty soon we'll be able to be talking about the things I care about. And I generally find that people who have bought into a scientific worldview, here's the good news. Atheists, I think, are the kind of bad children of Christian culture. We tend to produce them. Atheists pop up most often where there's a robust vision of Christianity or where there has one. So often we have a lot in common if we can just get to a common language. But the Father is right. That's going to take time, and it takes patience in not making the atheist critic always speak our jargon, always speak our language.
You have to remember that sometimes people become atheist because the kind of religion, the kind of Christianity that they're fighting against isn't really viable. It just it doesn't work. A lot of atheists were former fundamentalists. Okay, and so what they're arguing against is the fundamentalism in which they were raised. Okay, now once you grasp that, right, then what you start doing is expanding their concepts of what Christianity is, what faith in God is. Ultimately you tell them about Christ, not even Christianity, but about Christ.
Generally, what I find is a lot of people who wish atheism were true also dislike some of the moral teachings of the church. And let's face it, they're difficult. But the problem with an ethical system is if we abandon our ethical system just at the point where it bites me, if I opt out just at the moment when my tendency to overeat is challenged by the church, then my ethical system ends up not being much good. But the church makes difficult claims on us, and if we could get out of those difficult claims, if we could get the joy of Christianity without the difficult claims, a lot of people would like to do that.
I think too that sometimes you're really right about that. But if you look at them, you talk to them even closer, what you see is that they kind of impose a self-discipline on themselves. I mean, they're still looking for that meaning. For example, tattoos. You know, if you talk to a person who has a tattoo, the reason they put a tattoo on their body is because it has some symbolic meaning to them, right? And it's kind of a crazy way to do it, but that's the way they do it. I think sometimes, too, even studs and disfiguring your face. I think sometimes what it is an attempt to impose discipline. It comes deep from the inside. You know, it's not just a fad. It's not just a style. There's something else to that. And what am I saying here? What I'm saying is be very discerning, be very compassionate, especially if the person approaches you, and listen very, very closely, because they're going to end up opening their heart to you.
Well, we're going to have to wrap up, gentlemen.
I talk to college students, and I see beautiful expressions of faith in their attire, sometimes in tattoos, as it comes across. And then I see people who harm themselves in just sort of terrible ways because they hate themselves. And so I know this sounds cheesy, but coming back to the love of Jesus, coming back to a Father who doesn't sit in the pig pen with us, who isn't enabling to our difficulties, but who, the minute we get out of the pig pen, sees us and runs to us a long way off, is always encouraging to me intellectually, because I know sometimes I sit in the pig pen of my own stupid thoughts about the world, but if I lift my head up, if I climb out of that pig pen and start heading towards goodness, truth, and beauty, then I found that God meets me way more than halfway.
Yes, that's really true. And sometimes you're God to that person who's trying to find a way out. You really are.
Well, I hate to end on that note, but that will be our program this evening. I want to thank Father Hans Jacobsy and John Mark Reynolds. Thank you both very, very much for joining us this evening, Father Hans and John Mark.
Well, it was delightful. I had a good time.
Yeah, me too. I hope it went well. I hope your audience really liked it. And Kevin, God's blessing on the program. I hope it's very successful. It's very good work you're doing.
Thank you very much. And sorry we didn't get to all of your calls. We had far more than we had time for. Please try again on the next program, which will be on May 3rd at 8 p.m. Central, 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central, 5 p.m. Pacific. And my guest will be Father George Aquaro, the subject demons, the paranormal, and exorcism. You won't want to miss it. You can follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Have a great week. Christ is risen.